Figma's new UI, UI3, is finally out of beta, and now it should be available to you either in your desktop version of Figma or in the browser when you access it. A lot of things have changed about the UI in general, like from the layout, where some of the tools are, but also a lot of the iconography and just positioning of elements and location of them in your design panel. I figured it'd be useful just to make a video walkthrough of some of the key things that you may be used to using in Figma, things like constraints or auto layout, components and variants, as well as touching on variables and variable modes, just so we can go over some of the UI updates in a more like video format. What I'm going to also do is just do this in the context of recreating some designs. We'll take a look at those here shortly, but I think one thing that's also good for everybody to go ahead and just bookmark and use is Figma's documentation around UI3. So they have an article on Figma Learn that I'll link in the description below for this video that is just called Navigating UI3. And it goes over some of the rationale for why the redesign happened. It talks about a little bit about some of the major changes that are probably going to be very evident when you open up Figma. But also, I think the most useful part of this entire article is where did a feature move to? So if you really can't find, something specific that you're looking for, or you're just trying to get a better sense of where some of the changes happened, this can also just be a great reference guide for going back and forth between. It covers everything from, where editing access is, and goes through auto layout, changes to clip content, and even all the way down into, where variants are, how to edit vectors, and all that kind of stuff. Also gives you instructions on how you can go back to the old mode if you would prefer to use that. I will say that I don't know how long they'll support the old mode, so just keep that in mind. It may be good just to onboard yourself into UI3, because I feel like although the UI is holistically different and a lot of iconography has changed, some of the naming has changed as well, it's not as hard to get used to, especially if you've been using Figma for a while. And if this is something you're just diving into right now and you're using Figma from day one, I think you're going to find your way pretty quickly. So I do want to preface in this video, I'm not going to go through every UI3 change in depth. I think that's what that documentation can be really great for. And I'm sure Figma will put out more in-depth guides around the content that they've changed in their new software. However, I'm going to go through some of the more high-value stuff that I think most designers are using in their everyday workflow, just so we can go over some of the changes in the design panel, changes to icons, and some of the naming changes as well. So big things I'm going to cover are constraints, auto layout, absolute positioning. We're going to go through components and variants, and then I'm going to briefly touch on variables and variable modes, mainly because the way you access those in your designs is a little bit different in terms of where it's located in the UI and the design panel once you've defined your variables. But first, I do want to just go over some of probably the biggest change in this entire thing, and this is going to be the placement of the toolbar. So a lot of this stuff is going to be super familiar, right? So you have access to your move tools, your frame, your regular shape tools, pen tool, text, comments, and then what's going to be the biggest changes is things on the right-hand side here. So dev mode is now directly accessible from the toolbar. That's kind of a cool change. You can just swap in and out of that, and use it as you need to if that's something you use. This, of course, is going to be only available if you have like an educational or professional plan, so keep that in mind. Now, the thing that's probably most interesting is actions. So here's going to be a place where you can access a lot of different actions, no pun intended there. So you have access to your assets, just like you do still here in this left-hand panel as well. This is also a quick way to get into your widgets and plugins. I do just want to mention that the right-click menu is still available, and you still have, plugin access here, widget access here, and you can also get into actions right from here as well. So the nice thing about what's in here so far is we have a lot of common settings that if you don't remember, the shortcut to search in Figma, or you don't want to navigate through menus, it's a great way to be able to edit some of your quick settings and stuff like that. Also, it'll save any kind of recent things that you've opened inside of this, like search bar, which I think is great. It can be really helpful to get you started with, updating your nudge, getting to keyboard shortcuts, and all that kind of stuff. Lastly, this is where some of the more AI-driven features are going to appear throughout designs. I'm not going to go through any of that today. That might be something I do in a future video, but Actions is cool. It's got a lot of really unique characteristics and tools inside of it that we can use, and I think it just makes searching through Figma things a lot simpler. For the rest of this video, I'm going to use this Airbnb screenshot and recreate some of the elements within it so that we can go through in like a contextual example where changes have been made to some of the key tools you might be using in Figma. So looking at this screenshot, I'm going to recreate kind of 3 different things and go through specific tools around those elements. So I'm going to recreate this experience card. So we'll get a look at auto layout and absolute positioning, any of the changes to the UI, as well as some name changes there. I'll also go through setting up an icon set. This is really just more so to go through some of the constraint settings because I know a lot of icon libraries are already set up and ready to go for Figma, but this can be good to go through regardless. And then lastly, I'll go through creating components and variants and where some of that has updated in the UI, some of the icon changes and things like that might just be helpful to see an example for. Now, before I get started, if you want to follow along with the exercises that I'm going through and see some of the changes for yourself, feel free to grab a link to my Figma file in the description below. You will have to duplicate it to your own draft so that you have a copy of it. That way I can just keep a clean file for everybody to use that accesses this video. All right, so let's get started with icons and constraints. So a lot of times when you use icons, either from a plugin or a library sheet from, Figma's community files, they'll be set up and ready to go and you don't have to do a whole lot of editing. But most of the time, if you're grabbing raw SVGs for icons, or if you're creating icons from scratch, you'll want to set your icons up so that they have a little bit of consistent padding around them, which makes them easier to align and use in your design files consistently. So here we're going to go through how do we do that, but also really focus on some of the changes to constraints because it is a little bit different than it was before in the UI. So in my case, I'm going to grab all of these icons, just marquee select all of them, and option drag and grab them all. Just going to zoom in so that it's kind of focused and we can just see it nice and large on the screen in front of us. But I'm going to marquee select all of these again, press enter to select the vector frames, the vector layers for each one. And now I'm really going to focus on the design panel. So you'll notice that it used to be that we would see constraints immediately when we select something like this that's inside of a parent frame. But in this case, that's changed a little bit. So what you'll notice is this kind of crosshair blue icon on the right-hand side. This is now where your constraints are located if you have access to them, depending on, the child-parent relationship, if you're using auto layout or not, that kind of stuff. Having all of these selected, I can just open up the constraints for all of them, and you'll see that this UI feels super familiar. We've seen a lot of this before. The positioning may be a little bit different, but in terms of the tools that are available to you for how you're constraining an element inside of its frame. And we can still also use this kind of quadrant UI as well to define different constraints for each one of our layers. Now, in this case, we're going to want to, set these up so that we can add spacing consistently around them. So we're just going to want to keep them in the center of our frame to do that. All right, so now that we've constrained our icons into the center of our frame, now we can consistently add spacing around the icons. So to select all of the frame above, so the parent frame for each one of these, I'm just gonna hit Shift and Enter. That's gonna go one step up. And now one thing I will want to do is unconstrain the proportions here so that I can just make the changes without making any updates to the icons themselves or stretching them. In this case, I think I'm just gonna do 24 for each one, just give it a little bit of space around each one. And now if we look at each one of these, the spacing is consistent and we can use our positioning tools to help align some of the stuff if we needed to. But really, that's all I wanted to touch on for constraints because it does change where it is and you do have it, depending on what you have selected, you will have it hidden or it'll be available by default. It really just depends on whether you've clicked on the icon or not. One thing that is kind of nice about the icon updates, at least, is it does change depending on the constraints that you're using. So in our case, we do want to go back and now change this to a constraint of scale in both directions. So that if we change the size of the icon space, the icons all kind of scale consistently. So let's go ahead and do that. And you'll notice how the icon itself changes. That can be a little bit useful. It is kind of small, but it is nice to be able to look at that and notice okay, I know based on what's showing up on my icon, what kind of constraints I'm using. So let's take a look at auto layout and some of the changes to absolute positioning and auto layout. All right, so in this exercise, I'm going to focus on auto layout and ignore auto layout, aka absolute positioning, for a lot of this design. We're going to recreate this Airbnb experience card that's on the left-hand side, but really we're focusing in on kind of the changes that have been made to auto layout, where it's falling in the UI, as well as the name change / icon changes for absolute positioning. In this case, I'm just going to grab a rectangle, quickly sketch around my image, and draw that down here. Not really worrying about it being super perfect in this case, but let's go ahead and rename it. So we're trying to manage and follow best practices as we go. I'm just going to call this image placeholder. Okay, cool. So one thing to note is corner rounding. That's moved a little bit. That's now in this appearance section, what used to be known as the layer section in the design panel. So we can just use that like always. And I'm going to guess this is around 16 pixels. Looks kind of close. And we'll kind of leave that as is and keep it moving. All right, I'm going to grab my content from here. Just select all of it and then option drag. Now in this case, I think I'm going to put each one of these into an auto layout frame just to give me a little bit of control for the spacing around each piece of content, as well as put it on an auto layout frame as a parent so that I can adjust spacing between it and all that kind of good stuff. So I'm going to just grab each individual layer, hit Shift A to put it in an auto layout frame. So Shift A for this one, same for that, and same for this one. I'm going to rename them as I go just so I can stay organized, and if I need to move stuff around, it's a little bit easier. So we'll call this just title. For the second frame, we can call this host. And for the third frame, we can call that maybe just like status in this case. Cool. So I think for all of these, I'm going to likely put them in a parent frame for auto layout too. And let's use the auto layout tool on the right-hand side, or use the new icon, if you will. So in the auto layout section that appears because all of these frames have auto layout, you can see this new little icon over here that is called Use Auto Layout. It's kind of obvious once you see it, but it is a little bit of a different icon, so I wanted to point it out. But if you click this, it's going to put everything in an auto layout frame. And Figma is going to make some suggestions for you in terms of what auto layout settings it thinks you want. Now, in our case, we're definitely going to have to update some of this, but it is good to go through this. So this section should look pretty familiar, right? Like we have a lot of the same features. We have gap, we have different types of padding going on, and we also have, gap in different directions because we're working with wrap. Now, the other thing that we have is just all these layout options that we typically use, right? So vertical, horizontal, or wrap. We have our grid for moving, our orientation of inner components around. And then we also have our height and width, which is new. This is moved down from what used to be somewhere up here into the auto layout section. And now all of your height and width tools are here. So if you want to, use fixed, hug, or fill, we'll see that in a second, as well as your max and min width. And you can also just put fixed values in here as well. Now, obviously, this is probably not what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and rename the frame just to stay consistent. And we'll call this just card content. And here we're going to go for a vertical orientation just so everything is vertically stacking down. I'm not going to really worry about the padding quite yet. I'll adjust that here in a second. But one thing I do think I'm going to do, just so we can go through it, is I'm going to adjust all of these different pieces of content to be filled, to fill their container. So in this case, we can go here, fill our container for width. And now we have to end up messing around with our little grid system because obviously we don't want everything centered, and we probably don't want everything aligned in the center at all because we don't need that in our case. So I might move that up to the left, and we can probably reduce this 8 pixels of gap because we're actually not gapping anything at this point. So here we go. Card content all set up, ready to jam. We have our image placeholder. That's great. And now the only thing we also need is this little icon up here. So let's go and grab this guy. Cool. We're going to end up popping that right on top of the image. I think here, just to save some time, I'm going to use the appearance corner rounding and just hit 99. This will just circle out a rectangle for you or give you a circular shape. Now I'm just going to select all these elements and let's wrap them in an auto layout frame. We can use the button this time so that I'm not just using shortcuts because I know I don't have a text reader for this. So let's go ahead and put all of those in our auto layout frame. Now again, Figma's tried to make a smart adjustment for us here, but it's not exactly what we're looking for. We don't really want wrapping. And keep in mind, for this particular exercise, this may not be the way that you have to do this every time. I've kind of set this up so that I have to use auto layout for demonstration purposes so we can go over the name change and go over the icon change, but bear with me here. So let's go for a vertical layout in this case. So obviously this is not going to give us the layout that we want. So we have our image on top, and then we have this icon that's at the bottom, and then the text after it. So we want this particular element to use the new way to refer to absolute positioning. We want it to ignore auto layout, which is literally what it's now called. So let's go find where we can do that. So on the right-hand side, what we can see is we see a couple of different icons that we've interacted with before. We've seen use auto layout. And we have this kind of familiar icon that is now called ignore auto layout. This used to be called absolute positioning, so that is something just to be aware of. But this will allow us to break the control flow of Flexbox or auto layout in this case. And when we click that, we now have control over it like we did anytime with auto layout previously. So let's go ahead and move this around. In our case, we're just going to kind of throw that right here. I think in terms of my constraints, let's go ahead and fix the frame to hug content on the left and the right, so the width in this case. And in this case, I think we probably want our icon here to be constrained to the top and the right. That would be my guess, or a good place to start. Let's go ahead and rename our frame just to kind of like follow what we've been doing so far. And again, we can take a look at our left-hand side in the layers panel, and a lot of this stuff kind of feels very similar or very same to what we had done previously or how the UI used to look. So we have a base frame, we have the layers within it. This is signaling to us that it is, using absolute positioning, or in this case, ignoring auto layout as it's now called. We have our content in here, and we should be in a pretty good place for, going ahead and just using this little card that's already got auto layout all set up for it. Now, I do think that in order to use the copy paste properties for the image that we're going to bring in, I think I'm going to actually have to convert this and wrap this in our frame. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that with Option, Command, and G. And that should wrap everything there. We'll call this image placeholder again, just so we can be consistent in the naming. Cool. All right. So let's just make a copy of this. So if we wanted to componentize it, we could. And now let's just go ahead and paste this in to replace our rectangle here. Let's go to the copy paste properties, go to paste props, and boom, now we have that rounded rectangle. There are a couple of tweaks that we could definitely make here. So it does look like to me that the spacing here is maybe not exactly what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's also update our width of our content section to also fill the container so that we have that consistency across the design. In here, let's go through, and we definitely don't want 24 pixels of spacing. I think this is about 8. It looks about right to my eye. I think the biggest thing that we would want to change is maybe the top and bottom padding for this particular set of elements to squeeze them together just a little bit more. In this case, maybe we can try going down to 4, seeing if that gets us a little bit closer, or even 2. Since this does look like it's kind of slammed together, that might be a little bit too much. So I'm actually going to take these back up to 4. Again, this is just more so my eyeballing this kind of stuff because this is not the exact serial font from Airbnb. This is just like some default enter. Now, the spacing and all that looks pretty similar, but again, the goal is really to focus in on what's changed in the UI in terms of absolute positioning, in terms of auto layout, all that kind of good stuff. So this should give you a nice overview of that. And let's dive into components and variants and some of the changes that have gone into that. All right, for this particular exercise, let's focus in on trying to add a little bit of a nav bar that is similar to what you see in Airbnb's website. I've got some colors and icons already created for us here for us to use for this exercise. And in this case, it's going to be pretty straightforward. And I really want to focus more on the kind of component changes that have been made in terms of where they're laying them out now and where the toolbar for that stuff is, as well as just some of the icon changes that can at first be a little bit different when you look at them, but I think it kind of holds true to what we've seen previously. So in this case, I'm going to make some very generic or base component that I can swap a lot of content into. And that way we can go through a couple of things. We can look at components, we can look at component properties, but we can also take a look at variants and setting up all that stuff. Because although the workflow is very much the same, just its layout in the design and some of the icons used is a little bit different, and it's something to get used to. So for this, I think I'm just going to use a instance of my search icon as my base. I might even just upgrade the size of this for the sake of what we're doing here. And I think I'll just zoom on into this part of the design because we can still access our colors quickly, all that kind of good stuff. Now, looking at this, it feels like we need 3 icons. Cool. That's going to be fine. We'll end up putting a swap property on here. But we do need some kind of text for the label itself. So let's just go ahead and make that for us. All right. I'm going to just use, whatever the default is, because I don't think the Airbnb serial is in here. I'm just going to turn this to regular so that we can show kind of a drastic state change. But in either case, I think that's really all we need to get started. So let's go ahead and throw these on an auto layout frame. And again, our auto layout panel is where we can make all of these adjustments for any of the spacing and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to just go ahead and throw like 4 pixels of spacing there, center everything. And now I think we're kind of in a place where we have like our initial nav item. So let's just rename it. And here I'm going to add a different setting for the fill. I'm going to have this hug its content so that as we change it, we should be able to have it just adapt to the content as we go. And now I think we're kind of ready to make this into a component. So where this used to be was right above when you selected all of your elements, but it's no longer there. One thing I want to mention is if you use a lot of shortcuts in Figma, I really don't think the new UI change is going to make any impact on you because you're already using a lot of the accelerators for this, and you don't have to worry about that tools have changed or like placements of things have changed, because if you use a shortcut, you're going to see a lot of the things you need after using it. But in the case of people who don't use a whole lot of shortcuts in Figma, this will be helpful. So when you select something, it used to be that you would select up here to create a component. Now we have to actually just navigate to the right-hand side in our design panel, and you'll see that the create a component action is going to appear right at the very top. When you have multiple components or multiple elements, you'll get different options. So you'll get the ability to create a component set or create multiple components. So you will still have access to all those options that you're used to from the regular toolbar placement, which is super great. In this case, let's just create a component, and cool, we're kind of getting started now. Nothing really has changed big in terms of that. One thing to note is once you've created a component and you have a component selected, you now will have the add a variant option in the top right, which is great. It's typical to what we used to see when we had stuff in the middle of the screen as well. So in our case, let's create a couple properties just to go through that, because some of the UI is a little bit different for it. In this case, let's create a text property. What's really nice is the icon for creating properties has stayed the same. So it's still that triangle, or it's still that diamond with the line going through it. So most of the times anywhere you see that, for argument's sake, in the appearance section, we see that as well. And in the typography section, other places in the UI, you'll see it all the time. But let's go ahead and create a text property. So let's just go here and we'll just name this label and create the property. Turns purple, all good. You have your property set up. Let's go ahead and add the icon swap property as well. I'm going to rename this to icon just to have it be a little bit more generic for me. And now what we can do, and this is a little bit different than it used to be. So this is something I think that's worth paying attention to. There used to be a place somewhere in like this section of the UI where the icon swap would appear. Now it appears at the top of the screen. And if you want to create a property for an icon swap, this is where you're going to find it. You're going to find it kind of in that place where we were seeing component and variant appear. So just be mindful of that. When you want to make an instance swap property, it's going to be in the top of your design panel when you have the instance swap selected. So let's go ahead and create that. I like to use action words for this kind of stuff. So I'm just going to say update, if I can type, icon, and that'll just give me a list of icons that I can swap. Let's go ahead and just, add the other ones to our component list so that they're already there for us. And cool. All right, so that goes through a lot of the main changes, and we'll go through variants. I just want to check and make sure that my component is interacting in the way that I would expect it to at this point. So can I swap icons? Yes, I can. Can I change labels and have it adapt? Nope, I need to adjust some of my settings. That's good. That's why we do this kind of stuff. So what is the problem here? So I think I just need this particular element. Oh, that makes sense. I just need it to hug its content, and then we should have something that's a little bit more dynamic. All right, cool. That's why we test these icons. There is a kind of a second adjustment that I'll make and just making sure color holds over right, but we'll do that as part of the variant walkthrough. So let's create a variant for this because we want to support both of these states, and we'll be a little bit more mindful now of like what the color scheme is and all that kind of good stuff. All right, so here, if we select the parent or master component and go back to the top and try and add a variant, you'll see the add a variant button now replaces the component button. Go ahead and do that. And just like normal, you'll have 2 variants appear, and similar to what you've experienced before, you're going to have a new variant property that's created for you. Now, the location of the variant properties is a little bit different. It used to be further down in the UI. Now it appears at the very top. And here we just want to make sure that we're being constantly mindful of renaming some of this stuff so that it becomes easier to use over time. But again, the main change here is the variant icon, the add variant icon, and then where properties are appearing inside of your design panel. So let's go ahead and rename this. We'll call this state. And then I'm just going to give it 2 different names. We'll call you default. That's totally fine. And then for this one, we'll just rename it to active. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and just like make some color changes here. I wonder if I can do this just once. There we go. Beautiful. All right, let's do the same for our selection colors here as well. I think that's this gray. Awesome. So now let's just test our icon or our variants to make sure they work. Big fan of doing that. I like to make sure that all my variant stuff works before I start finishing up UI and all that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and swap some of the icons. Great, that works. Let's go, I don't know what this is called, wish lists. Great, so that works pretty well. Seems like it, will suffice for the design that we're trying to create here. So to wrap this up, I'm just gonna move our variant set up to the top here and grab 2 more of these. Just again, option dragging to do that. I'm gonna throw them in an auto layout frame so that I can give them this white background and around the edges and all that kind of good stuff. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add a fill to this. All right, so let's go in here and let's edit up some of these nav items. And let's start with Explorer. Go ahead and update the label. We can update the state to be active. And then that's our base icon as well. We can go ahead and update this one's label to be log in, 2 words for this one, count, and it is default as well. Let's add a little bit of padding on either side. So I'm actually going to use the auto setting here, mainly just so that we can see it. It's not something you would necessarily have to do in this case, but I'm just going to set this to auto. Again, if you haven't used auto layout before, this is just going to create an automatic amount of space based on the amount of space that's given in the frame. So for argument's sake, if we make this a little bit larger to match our design up top, that space is going to change dynamically. Now, what I'm going to do to help us get to the InDesign, rename this app nav, is I'm going to add a little bit of padding on either side. I'm going to take a guess that there's somewhere around, I don't know, 60 pixels of padding maybe on either side. I could be wrong, but let's give that a shot and see how it goes. So let's try 120 on the right and left. Or let's try like 60 on the right and left first and see how that is. And let's try doubling that to 120. That's pretty close. It's not quite exact, but close enough for the purposes of what we're doing here. Then we can add, padding on the top and bottom. We can try 8 pixels, which looks like it's getting a little bit closer. And then we can also, use the tools to help us add in rounded corners at the bottom if we want to as well. I'm just going to throw 16 on the right and left, kind of like you'd expect if you're looking at an app nav or something like that. And cool. We have something that looks pretty close to the original. We're able to, make sure that we know where all the new auto layout things are. I think the biggest thing that's changed or that took a little bit of getting used to looking at the UI is that the hug and fixed and fill is all located in auto layout now. I think ultimately it makes sense, but it is a big change. Also, too, just the icon changes between auto layout having, a new icon and then absolute positioning being something named different. And lastly, in this case, I think the biggest thing that you'll probably have to get used to is just when we talk about when we talk about components, the changes in the UI are a little bit different. So we have to think about like when you create a component, like, okay, all of those component creation tools are going to be in the right-hand side. And then now we have all of our props and things like that. And what's kind of nice too, on top of this, at least from my perspective, is it does keep all of the properties and things like that for instances at the very top of the screen versus having them at the bottom or in the middle, whatever it used to have, where it created a lot of scrolling to get back to your positioning or layout tools. So that's kind of nice, keeps everything pretty localized. But outside of that, those are some of the major changes that are going on for UI3 that I think are going to impact, just day-to-day workflow. I do want to touch on variables and modes just briefly. So I'm going to briefly go over variables and modes because I don't think a whole lot has changed. And I'm not going to go through how do you set up variables and how do you create modes. I'm more so going to go through where you access them in the UI now, once you've created them and you've applied them in your UI. I think that'll be a little bit helpful because the section has changed, although the icon is similar, and it'll just be good to get an overview of where the stuff is. Just as a reminder, you still, to access variables and associated modes, you have to have nothing selected. You end up going to this local variables on the right-hand side of the design panel. And once you select that icon in local variables, you're going to see whatever collections you have available to you. If you haven't created anything, it's going to be empty. It'll look something a little bit like this. that'll be where you're starting. For the purpose of this video, I created some very basic light and dark mode changes, just using color variables and color modes. And really, again, this is more just to showcase where accessing your variables are for frames once you've created them, applied them to the designs. So just to go over this a little bit, when you look at your frames, it's going to be very similar to what we had done previously, right? So when you have a variable and you've applied it, it's going to appear in that, like in the fill, in this case, for all of my colors. If we go into one of our nav items, we're going to see this as well. I think really it'll probably be easier to see that here in the selection colors. But yeah, so you go to each like particular place in the UI, you apply a variable, and then that'll proliferate through the design, which is great. Now from here, the thing that is similar to the previous iteration of Figma's UI, but it's worth going over, is now the appearance section, what I think was formerly known as the layout section. This is where you're going to actually access your variables that you've applied in your design. That's one thing that is worth noting about variables and modes. They're not going to be accessible to the design just because you created them. You have to actually go and actively apply them before you can like turn the different modes on and off. So in the appearance section, if you have variables that have been applied in your design, you're going to have this apply variable mode icon come up. Looks like 2 hexagons with a dot in the middle of it. Once you click that, it's going to give you access to any collection that you've applied somewhere in whatever UI. So in my case, I've got light and dark mode as my 2 variables that I've created. And similar to, how variable modes worked previously, your auto mode is going to be that first mode that you create of variables. And that's what's going to be your quote unquote default, if you will. So in this section, on this second one, let's go ahead and add dark mode to it just to see the changes. So if we add dark mode real quick, again, similar to what we have seen in our previous iterations of Figma, you have this dark mode indicator on the layers panel. You have it indicated here a little bit more saliently, which is great, in the appearance section as well. And you can just like swap in between those two. So not a whole lot to go over there. I didn't want to go in depth on, approaching variables and modes, mainly just approaching where it is in the UI, how to find it, because the section has changed a little bit since it's no longer in the layers. So I do think that's going to wrap it up for this video on UI3 and hitting on some of the maybe more high value things that you do day to day as a designer, or where tools and some of the different changes might be impacted. I do think next week I'm going to release a similar video taking this same design a little bit further. So again, recreating this design a little bit more in full, but focusing on prototyping just to explore any of the changes that have happened to the prototyping UI as a change to UI3. I don't think there is a wholesale version of changes for prototyping. I think it's probably just going to be the menus look a little bit different. There may be some wording changes, but I'll go over some of that for prototyping next week, and we'll build out some more of this same design. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.